What does philanthropy mean to you? Do you think of charity? Do you think of giving? Do you think of the haves and the have-nots? Do you think philanthropy is a one-way transaction where wealthy individuals like Bill and Melinda Gates, like Nicola and Andrew Forrest, give money to their charity or cause of choice? Maybe you don't really know what philanthropy is. That was me until a few years ago. I didn't really know what philanthropy was. That didn't stop me having opinions about philanthropy. I had strong opinions, and I was pretty cynical. I thought philanthropists were wealthy individuals who hadn't paid their fair share of tax, who made themselves feel better about that by giving some of their money to people in need. And then I spent time looking at philanthropy in the US as part of a Fulbright scholarship. And I learned that one way to think about philanthropy is improving the welfare of others. That might be through generous financial giving, but it doesn't have to be. I really liked that approach to philanthropy because it means that anyone can be a philanthropist, that we can all be philanthropists. I became interested in how we might expand a culture of philanthropy around that idea, and I started working more closely, particularly with corporate philanthropists. I would go to events put on by corporate foundations talking about the charities they were supporting. And along with everyone else in the room, I would be swept up by inspiring tales of social impact, of creative solutions to deep problems. And then, invariably, there would be this moment where one executive or another from the corporate foundation would make a comment that I have come to call biz-splaining. Biz-splaining. It's like mansplaining, but it's what businesses do to charities. And the more I watched businesses biz-splaining, the more I realised it came from a place where they didn't really understand what they were supporting. The more I understood biz-splaining was a barrier to philanthropic effectiveness. On one occasion, the head of philanthropy for a major tech company was talking about a water sanitation charity they were supporting in a developing country. The charity only had 2 paid staff, the rest of its workforce were volunteers, and they were doing well. They'd secured clean water close to this community for the first time. But, said the head of foundation, the charity is so underfunded. Imagine if they had the resources to scale up what they're doing. They could really have an impact. Now, if you're a global tech company, you measure success in terms of size and scale. Those measures have dollar signs. This corporate foundation was applying the same metrics to its interpretation of the impact of a water sanitation charity in a local community in a developing country. Classic biz-splaining. Because what they'd missed was not only had this charity achieved its intended impact, it had surpassed it. That volunteer workforce was not a cheap labour supply. They were members of the community themselves, learning the skills to sustain clean water for their own community beyond the life of a charity's funded project. Intended impact achieved and achieved sustainably. That's impact by anyone's definition of success. But it wasn't evident to the corporate foundation that was supporting that work. On another occasion, a group of senior executives were talking about a charity they were supporting that was working with extremely vulnerable women. The execs were impressed that the charity had managed to maintain the trust of a group of women who were usually extremely socially isolated. But the execs were concerned that the charity had poor governance. They'd had an opportunity to observe one of the charity's board meetings and, they said, it was just a bunch of women sitting around a kitchen table. Now, if you're a stock exchange listed company, your governance is a pretty formal affair. You follow formal meeting procedure. Motions are moved and seconded. There's a lot of suits around your table and there's probably not a lot of women. These execs were taking the same hallmarks of governance that they understood and applying it to the charity working with this group of women. Classic biz-splaining. Because what they'd missed was that this bunch of women sitting around a kitchen table included the women who were using the service, the women who were delivering the service, and its funders. This was a pioneering example of consumer-directed care years before those became buzzwords that we now see right across the social policy landscape. But again, the foundation supporting that work couldn't understand its impact. Now, if I'm so interested in expanding the culture of philanthropy, why am I giving corporate foundations such a hard time? Well, the problem with bizsplaining is not just that it's patronising. The problem with bizsplaining is that it's a symptom of a much deeper problem, and that is when philanthropy gives dollars but not respect. A one-way gift of funding, no matter how generous, is simply a donation. The promise of philanthropy is much more than that. The promise of philanthropy is impact. But no transaction of funds, no matter how compassionately motivated, is a guarantee of impact. For philanthropy to be effective, it needs to understand the context to which it's giving. It needs to recognise that it's part of an ecosystem and to respect the contribution of others in that ecosystem. The expertise of charities that philanthropists give to achieve their mission. The lived experience of communities that philanthropists and charities work with. For philanthropy to be effective, it needs to work in partnership. I've worked with philanthropists who approach their philanthropy through partnership, and I've seen how effective it can be. I've worked with philanthropists who follow a financial grant by asking, what else do you need? Who listen to our response and who then explore what else they can do to help us meet those needs. It might be by giving us access to the skills of their employees. It might be by connecting us through their relationships with other businesses. It might be by introducing us to organisations who share our values or our mission. Far from bizsplaining, these are textbook examples of philanthropy through partnership, and they achieve much more than a financial grant alone. Of course, the responsibility for these kinds of respectful relationships is not only the burden of philanthropists. As charities, we need to invest in our relationships with the philanthropic community, to share our values, to talk about our work, to explain why we take one approach and not another. But the return on that investment is not just a good relationship with our philanthropic funders. It is a significantly increased impact in our ability to meet our charitable purpose, which is the reason we exist in the first place. In my own case, working with a charity startup, it was the grant from a foundation that got us off the ground. But it was the opportunity for their employees to engage with us as skilled volunteers, to share expertise about communications, about web design, to connect us through networks that we could never have achieved ourselves. It was those contributions that helped us soar. Effective philanthropy requires philanthropists and charities to listen to each other, to learn from each other. Not telling, not bizsplaining, but listening and learning. When philanthropists are willing to give and to learn, when charities are willing to take and to teach, that is the recipe for philanthropy through partnership, the recipe for truly effective philanthropy. Thank you.